Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. Up to 100,000 union members across health and education are on strike today. The action prompted Public Service Minister Judith to pen a letter to New Zealanders saying the strikes are more about politics than outcomes. The mega strike is being tipped to be the largest in our history. So, as nurses, doctors and teachers take to the picket line, we'll take a look back at industrial action in Aotearoa and whether it's all actually worth it. Today on the front page, University of Wellington emeritus Professor Gordon Anderson is with us to discuss the history of labour laws in New Zealand. Gordon, what's happening this week is being called historic. Would you agree?
Semi-historic, and probably historic within the living memory of anyone who's around these days. I mean, the last massive strike, of course, which went on for a long time, was the 1951 waterfront lockout. And we had quite high strike levels in the mid-1970s. But since then, strike numbers have been relatively low. So up a bit in the 80s, but since 1990, extremely low levels until the last couple of years.
Well, I was going to say, the last couple of years, it does feel like there have been a lot more strikes than, I quote, usual, I suppose. Is that right?
Yes, they sort of come and go. The main difference, of course, is that the strikes these days tend to be in the public sector because the unions that used to go on strike don't really exist anymore. So, the classical unions that used to go on strike were the meat works, some of the transport industry, the wharfs, seafarers, those sort of people. But those unions, of course, have largely disappeared as that type of work disappeared. So the big unions these days, well, there always were the big unions, they just used to strike as often, are the big public sector unions. So the only large unions left in New Zealand, with the exception of Aotearoa, which of course is very widespread, but the only large unions with a single employer tend to be the state sector unions. And it's only lawful to strike when you're striking in relation to collective bargaining. So if you're likely to have large numbers of strikes, and they have to relate to collective bargaining, it's obviously going to be collective bargaining in the state sector, who are the only big employers.
Is that something that's changed over time? I mean, how has the law evolved to become the Employment Act that we see today?
Well, in very broad terms, you weren't supposed to go on strike at all until about 1987.
Oh, wow, that's quite late.
However, that didn't stop people doing it.
Right.
and there was a sort of period from about the early 1970s onwards when strikes were quite common. You had a rather strange position there when they weren't unlawful under the Act, but they were unlawful at common law. In the main, everyone just ignored the common law. However, in 1987, there was a specific statutory definition of a lawful and unlawful strike put into legislation, and that's been there ever since. So it's really only after that time that the legality of the strike has been a major issue. And that was narrowed a little bit in 1991 so that you can only strike in relation to bargaining for a collective agreement that's going to cover you. And that's still the current law.
Does that still kind of stand up today, or should there be any more changes to labour laws, in your opinion?
It seems to have worked relatively well up until now. I mean, if you ask the unionists, they would claim the current restriction is too narrow because it stops sympathy strikes. On the other hand, there is some compensation for that in the ability of employers to use replacement labour during a strike. So there's a balance. It's not a balance everyone would perhaps wholly agree with, but it's not totally unreasonable either.
What are sympathy strikes?
Oh, it's if I go on strike to support you not refusing to finish the podcast.
All right.
So, yeah, if your boss turns up...
In solidarity.
Yeah, in solidarity, yeah.
No worry about that happening. We'll get this done, Gordon. Recent reforms have seen things like pay deductions for partial strikes. What does that suggest about the current government's approach to industrial action?
Depends which bit of the current government you ask, I suspect. I mean, the current Minister for Workplace Relations is obviously not exactly pro-worker, if I can be polite. And I'm
You don't
sure
have to be polite here.
Yeah, I'm sure there are elements within the government who'd be quite happy to further restrict the ability to strike. Yeah, as long as you've got it, and as long as people are doing collective bargaining, there's not really a problem. The problem you have with the state sector, of course, they should actually be doing the bargaining, because essentially, of course, this is bargaining between an employer and employees. And what's happening is a very strong political element is creeping in. And the more politicians are involved, probably the more political it gets, rather than trying to resolve particular industrial disputes. So, I mean, if we were dealing with private sector employers, the focus would probably be much stronger on how do we settle this dispute. How far are we prepared to go to increase pay and so on. But of course, the government's thinking of it, and I suspect in a wider terms, and particularly as they're in a period of austerity or that sort of thing. So that whole political side, of course, is coming into it and complicating the negotiations, which would normally be resolved at least at a slighter distance, I think, from ministers. But at the moment, all the comments are coming from ministers who, of course, should be a step back from employment negotiations.
Does the law as it stands have a good balance between a worker's right to strike versus minimising disruption to public services, say?
Pretty much. Employment Relations Act has a whole chunk in it on strikes, particularly in the health sector. And there is an obligation there to maintain the basic operations of the health sector. So while some routine surgery may not be able to be done, if you decide to have a heart attack today, you can still be assured that the appropriate services will be available to deal with that. And there is a mechanism for sorting that out if there's a disagreement between what the hospitals think the level of services should be and what the unions do. And that's usually fairly carefully observed, obviously.
Oh, look, this is a really important moment for New Zealanders to stand up and say we want better funded healthcare systems, better funded schools. And the reason for that is that we all need access to these services. And we don't want to turn up to a hospital and find there aren't enough nurses because they've all left to go to Australia for higher wages. We need to make sure we keep nurses in New Zealand, teachers in New Zealand. So I think it is really important for the whole country to stand up now and say, we want our hospitals, our schools funded properly, government. It's up to you to find the money and make sure they are funded properly.
How important is a worker's right to strike?
Extremely, because in the absence of it, you're stuck with taking whatever the boss offers. That you can't really do anything else. I mean, obviously, I suppose you can resign from the job and walk away from it, but then you go to another job that where you're in the same position. So the right to strike's essential to any form of workers being able to improve their conditions of employment. And of course, you have to remember that in the absence of a right to strike, it's usually individuals negotiating with large companies or something like that. So the economic leverage each has got is quite different. So collective bargaining definitely doesn't totally rebalance things, but it does give some degree of ability to try and negotiate better terms and conditions.
Do you think it's still useful as a bargaining tool?
Yes, workers don't usually go on strike in spite of what people seem to think at the drop of a hat, because it usually involves a drop of a day's pay. And most people, don't want to lose a day's pay. So you'll usually find there's something of a history going on around the strikes. I mean, for example, in the 70s and 80s, the classical tactic was the system tended to work on one or two strong unions going on strike and getting, say, a 5% pay rise, and everyone else would then get somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5. So there was a bit of a trend-setting element in strikes back then. These days, that's quite different because you don't have the award system and so on. But nevertheless, it is an essential part of the bargaining system.
Looking back at the history of strikes, I suppose, what is one that comes to mind that has made the most impact? And I suppose when I say impact, A, public disruption, I suppose, how, notorious it was at the time. And B, are there any strikes that have changed the course of employment law in New Zealand as we know it?
In terms of the ones that have had the biggest impact, it depends what you mean by impact, I suppose. And the ones I talked about in the 70s, where you had one strike essentially setting up what was going to be the rough approximate wage increase for everyone in the country over the next year or so, obviously had significant economic impact, but they're often relatively short strikes. Everyone knew, what the game was, so to speak. In terms of ones that have had a massive public impact, probably one that has was a strike at, was it the freezing works down at Bluff many years ago, when there was a decision to prosecute the people who had gone on strike, which never quite, there was Muldoon playing funny games before an election. That was quite significant in the sense that they then had to start rethinking strike law to sort of, I suppose, bring it into line with what was going on in practice and so on. But since then, one in terms of, changing employment law as a whole, probably not, because the law has now been pretty much settled since 1987, which seems like yesterday to an old person like me, but in fact, we're talking almost 40 years ago. So we've had an extremely stable system of employment law, at least strike laws, since then. So, and generally speaking, it works fairly well. That does allow the right to strike. It has some limits on the right to strike in that you have to be doing it in relation to collective bargaining, which limits the overall impact.
And does that mean that I can't, because I'm, if nobody, I can't just walk off the job just myself?
No, you can only strike if you're a union member and that union is negotiating a new collective agreement for you.
Yeah.
Well, there's an exception for safety and health strikes. If the ceiling above you is about to fall on your head, you could walk off. But but outside that, and those type of strikes are obviously very rare because it's usually someone refusing to sort of make safety improvements. But generally speaking, the number of people who can go on strike at any one time is somewhat constrained, and you'll notice in the current lot it's the ASMS on the doctors' side who are striking, but not the other two doctors' unions who don't have a collective agreement up for negotiation at the moment.
That's what Public Service Minister Judith Collins is doing, telling parents they should be quizzing teachers about the timing of the strikes. She's saying to parents, go and ask these clowns why they're striking, then having a teacher-only day, then having a day off on Monday because of the long weekend. The nerve of it. That's what she's saying. She is, for all intents and purposes, calling on people to harass teachers who aren't breaking the law, whose actions, might be a bit of an inconvenience, but that's all. As far as I'm concerned, the teachers shouldn't have to defend themselves to nagging parents and the government shouldn't be encouraging these parents to harass them about it. But that's how I feel, but how do you see it?
When it comes to, you mentioned before that ministers could do better at stepping back when it comes to collective bargaining. Is there any way that we can make that actually happen?
Well, not unless the ministers choose to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, the government, of course, is funding these settlements. But if you're trying to settle it, you usually do it by giving appropriate instructions to the State Services Commission, or what's it called these days? I don't know. The Public Service Commission.
Public services.
Yeah. The normal thing is the government will give some sort of fiscal flexibility, I suppose, and other flexibility to the Commission, who will then do the negotiations. What's unusual with the current round is that the Commissioner himself is directly controlling the negotiations. Previously, that used to be delegated to the Education Department or the Ministry of Health or whoever. So at the central employer level, there's the negotiating power has been sort of pulled back to the centre. And obviously, with the current government, ministers are much more directly involved. And you see, in fact, very little from the Commissioner. Most of the fronting up is being done, well, mainly by the Minister of Health. Occasionally the Education Minister sticks in. And, of course, you're not hearing anything at all from the Minister for Workplace Relations on this. So it's sort of, it's probably being made more political from that end, I think, rather than the union end, because obviously they're quite concerned because the pay levels increases being offered seem to be sitting below, amounting to a cut in real income. So obviously, that plus some general issues around working conditions are what's driving that side of things. But politically, of course, you've got a number of these big collectives have expired all at the same time, and they're all negotiating. So presumably the unions involved perhaps coordinating this to some extent and trying to get the biggest splash, which is succeeding quite well in. I mean, if you can all have a one-day strike and several 100,000 people involved, it looks at probably better from pushing a reinforced view of what should be going on rather than small strikes which don't get much attention.
Well, we're talking about it, aren't we, Gordon?
Yeah, indeed.
Thanks so much for joining us.
That's all right, no problem at all.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Jane Yee and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I'm Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for another look behind the headlines.